All right, so 2 points I wanted to make. First of all, I think John Adams has often been overlooked in history. He takes second place after some of his more flashier colleagues, particularly Alexander Hamilton of late because of the popularity of the musical. But I really find, and I hope you will too by the end of the discussion, and you might want to explore my book at another time too, John and Abigail Adams are really fascinating people, and they are so articulate. And while I was writing this book and two others, I kind of think of it as a trilogy. I began with revolutionary medicine, the founding fathers and mothers in sickness and health. And that talked about all the founders or the main founders, the Washingtons, the Adamses, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the Madisons, and their own encounters with sickness and health. You know, we of course have had very challenging times with COVID, but you must know that the founders encountered epidemics and illness almost every day of their lives. So it's something that they would have been very accustomed to. That led to my second book, First Ladies of the Republic, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and Dolly Madison in the creation of an iconic American role, that of First Lady, of course, because I had become very interested in the First Ladies when I was researching the first book. And then that morphed into this third book, A View from Abroad, the story of John and Abigail Adams in Europe, because I really wanted to concentrate on one slice of their life. They had such an eventful life. But as we talk about their time in Europe, I think you will see what a fascinating period it was and how influential it really was in their thought and later in their political development. So as I said, the first point is that I think John's been very overlooked. So I welcome the opportunity to shed a lens on his life and that of Abigail's. And the second is that most people, when they think about the American Revolution, they really focus on the battles and the war in the United States. But I don't think enough people are aware of how much of the revolution and its success really took place with American diplomacy in Europe. And a lot of that had to do with John Adams and help from Abigail when she got there. And then in the background as well, of course, Benjamin Franklin played a central role, but John really, I would say, played a more pivotal role even than Franklin, although he gets a lot of credit for what went on. So first, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that John and Abigail played a central role in the American Revolution. And most of the founders, of course, sacrificed a great deal on behalf of the American Revolution and the new republic, but I would say none more than John and Abigail Adams. John was at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia for such a long time. Abigail was left in charge, I wouldn't say on her own because she had parents near her and sisters, but she was responsible for the farm in his absence, the education of the children, the day-to-day financial tasks, including paying taxes, etc., things like that. And at one point, Abigail wrote John a letter and while he was there and said she's realized of the 14 years they were married at that particular time, they had been separated more than 7 of those years, more than 50% of that time. So John and Abigail, I would say, really were soulmates, and they really had a wonderful marriage, even though it was a typical 18th century marriage, and the husband was always considered the head of the household, and it was very hierarchical setup. But they really melded together on so many levels, and I would say Abigail was certainly John's intellectual equal. But can you imagine that much time that they were separated? And when he goes to Europe, you're going to see it was even more so and farther and for longer periods of time. So John had promised in 1778 to come back. He was released from the Continental Congress and he was going home to be with his family. He had missed so many seminal events, some of them very joyous, some not so so much. One event that makes, I think, people think of John as kind of crusty and very austere. He was not. He actually had a great sense of humor and was a very warm, affectionate person. But during one of his absences in Philadelphia, his wife Abigail gave birth to a stillborn baby. And so she wrote him after the event and said, of course, that she was so grateful. It was a sad event, and they had been looking forward to the birth of that daughter, who was actually had been named after John's mother, and she was stillborn. And she wrote John, and John wrote back and said, he was so grateful that Abigail had survived the ordeal and that she was well, but he just found it so sad. He said, he mused to her, isn't it a wonder how much one could miss a person they have never met or would meet? And that, of course, was the baby that had died. So I think that gives you a little more insight into his character and his capacity and how much he really did love his children. Anyway, he comes back in 1778 in the fall. He's supposed to resume his law practice, which has been neglected for a number of years. And he was a very successful, busy lawyer and traveled throughout Massachusetts and Maine. He was going to supposedly restore his health, which he felt had been damaged by all his time, and reunite with his family. And very soon he was called to Europe, and he agreed to go to France to join Franklin and Arthur Lee in trying to negotiate a treaty of commerce and amity with the French. Now I'm gonna stop for 1 minute. I have to get some hot water, and I'll be right back with you. So the first thing is he is leaving in the winter. The winter is the most dangerous time for an Atlantic crossing, which is dangerous anytime. I was in New York in January. I think my plane was delayed for about a half hour, which I found annoying. But then I reminded myself that John's journey to France took 6 weeks and 4 days, and it was anything but a calm journey. When he started out, they had to wait for several days in the harbor because of a winter storm, an icy storm. Then they encountered terrible storms at sea. At some point, he said that he had to hold on to the furniture to prevent himself from, to let himself be standing. Back again, sorry. And it was dangerous, not just because of voyaging was dangerous, but they were in the middle of the war. The ship was fired upon by the British. He recalled cannonballs whizzing overhead. One young man, one of the sailors, had been hurt. John helped the physician. He held on to the young man while his leg was amputated. The young man eventually died and was buried at sea. And I forgot to tell you that he also was accompanied by his 10-year-old son, John Quincy. Both the Adamses had recognized really early on that John Quincy was a very precocious child, really a genius. and they groomed him for greatness. So while they knew it was dangerous to go to Europe, they made up their mind that they were going to give him all the cultural opportunities and educational opportunities that they could. So he accompanied John. And I wanted to say a couple of things. Again, if you have a chance to read the book or the Adamses' letters, they were wonderful writers. And here's a letter that Abigail writes to John just a few weeks after he's left for Europe. "'Tis a little more than 3 weeks since the dearest of friends and tenderest of husbands left his solitary partner and quitted all the fond endearments of domestic felicity for the dangers of the sea, exposed perhaps to the attack of a hostile foe." So first you have to realize not only were they sacrificing, John is putting him and himself and his son in great danger physically, but he and Abigail have always been so dedicated to their country. And one of the things they both adhered to most was the idea of public virtue, that people, that citizens of a country had a duty on behalf of their country, and especially in this new country that was forming, this new republic. So they have a very, I would say, treacherous journey. It's also quite monotonous. At one point, John writes in his diary, "Every day I see sea, water, sky, and ship," and that alternates with ship, water, sky. So day after day. Can you imagine? Now, he was a great reader. They brought lots of books. They brought some creature comforts from home. He brought his own sheets and blankets, some of the food he liked, and he brought chocolate with him because he was a chocoholic. And later in Europe, he has friends send him chocolate because he misses that. So after that very harrowing journey, they get to France. And when John gets there, and he starts by being housed in the mansion that Benjamin Franklin has been loaned by a local, what shall I say, upper class gentleman. And he finds when he gets there that the purpose that he's gone to Europe for, to help create this treaty, has already been accomplished. They have already, Franklin and his cohorts have already accomplished that. So the question becomes, what is Adams's role? And he'll be frustrated many times because he says himself he doesn't know if he's suited to the role of a diplomat, because above all, he is very honest, has very difficulty dissembling, and always says what he means, and not necessarily the best prescription for a successful diplomat who has to be, I wouldn't say duplicitous necessarily, but has to really often beat around the bush. And Franklin actually excels at that. So John is frustrated, and he spends most of the time doing the clerical work for the commission, because Franklin, who he grows apart from as time goes on, spends a lot of his time socializing. Franklin is already in his 70s, and he loves company, and he really uses social occasions for diplomacy. And John doesn't always understand that. But John complains again in his diary, Franklin often doesn't come back to the house until midnight, 1 or 2 in the morning. Very hard to get his signature on anything. He rises late in the morning because he's been up so late. And Franklin and the other minister, American minister to France, Lee, are not getting along. And Adams is having spent a lot of time negotiating between the two American diplomats, spending more time with that, than he says, than addressing the French. And he also locks horns many times with the French foreign minister, because he thinks that the French are not respectful enough of the American position. But he works very hard to drum up French support through sending soldiers across and finances. And he does make some headway, and so does Franklin in that sense. But first, Adams is really overwhelmed with the culture and the beauty that he sees in France. And he finds the French very polite, very cultured. But in a few weeks, this is less than 2 months after he gets there, he writes in his diary, "I am wearied to death with gazing wherever I go at a profusion of unmeaning wealth and magnificence." He comparing it to his New England lifestyle, which he thinks is superior to everything in Europe. He finds the French, yes, very cultured, very polite. He accompanies Franklin to salons. He meets Voltaire. He meets the King and Queen of England. He is face to face with Louis XVI. Later, many years later, in a memoir, he writes that he's dazzled by the magnificence of Marie Antoinette. And I would say that even though he is not a proponent of monarchy, he does respect both the king and queen, and he feels that the king in particular, King Louis XVI, is well-meaning but naive. And he feels that the French government and the monarchy need reform, but he and Abigail later will be appalled at the French Revolution, what they consider the excesses when democracy gets out of hand, in the sense that the people, and he's afraid of the crowd when there is mob rule. So he has mixed feelings in France, but he and his son take advantage. John Quincy is in school in France, and they both teach themselves French. And John, even on the ship, the voyage, John is very assiduous, but it is John Quincy who has a great talent for languages. And I'll tell you on their second trip how that develops, because John Quincy will probably, by the time he becomes president, will probably be the most prepared in terms of foreign policy of any president after him or before him, and probably most after him as well. So they go to the opera together, they attend plays, and John always brings a dictionary, so the two of them can learn more about the language and they can translate what's going on stage. So even entertainment is mixed with education when John and Abigail are involved. So he leaves unsuccessfully and thinks that's his last time he'll be in Europe. They return, and within about a year, he's sent back on a second mission to Europe, back to France. And this time he takes both John Quincy and his second son, Charles. If the first voyage was difficult, it pales compared to the second voyage, because the ship they are on springs a leak. They have to disembark in Spain and travel overland thousands of miles by calish and mule. So, we're talking about the 18th century. He decides he can't wait for the ship to be fixed. They have no idea when that will happen. So he hires this broken down wagon. He's got his two sons. He's got two assistants, a servant and a secretary to his mission. They have to cross Spain. They're crossing treacherous mountains. They have bad weather. They're all of them become violently ill with bad colds. And I can empathize now because I'm challenged a bit. And John writes in his diary again, he's been traveling for 20 years, either on behalf of his work as an attorney or for the Continental Congress, all across the colonies. But he says never in 25 years has he encountered such a challenge as he has now. They have to stay in inns along the way. Some of the beds are infested with lice, while some of the food is interesting. In one cottage or one of the inns he's in, he writes in his diary, I don't think this floor has been swept in 100 years. So it's quite a challenge for them. And then he arrives in France. And again, feeling very frustrated with the French. He's feeling a little better because the French do send a huge number of troops to America, and there are a couple of major battles that are won because of French support. But he feels again frustrated with the French minister Vergennes. They don't get along well, and he finally decides, instead of really twiddling his thumbs in France, he is going to go to the Netherlands, where he thinks he can really make an impact because the United States is hovering on bankruptcy. The English are not yet ready, even though the tide has turned in the American Revolution in terms of the battles toward the success of the Americans. So he takes his two sons, his secretary, another assistant, and they travel to the Netherlands, and he spends about 2 years there, and he is eventually highly successful. John is a very industrious man, very responsible. He is sick there. He probably had malaria for a while, and he's very seriously ill. He's unconscious for a couple of days at one point. But he also does so many things to move the American cause forward. He makes friends with the merchants and the upper classes in the Netherlands. He is able eventually to persuade them to make 4 major loans to this new republic that everyone expects to collapse at any moment. Tens of millions of dollars at the time, probably hundreds of millions in our day. So he has to contend. There is a parliament. The Netherlands is a republic. It's made up of several provinces, and Holland is the biggest one. And Amsterdam at the time is really the banking capital of Europe. So he's in a good place. He becomes somewhat frustrated with the Dutch too, because it takes so long for them first to recognize the United States as a country, second to recognize him as the emissary from the United States, but it does come about. And actually the Netherlands is the second country after France to recognize the United States. He aligns, I would say, a lot of his values align better with the Dutch. They're also very industrious, frugal. At one point, though, he gets so frustrated, he thinks they're too stingy. And he says that he sees the Dutch, he writes to Abigail, they spend most of their time counting what we would consider nickels and dimes. But he is successful. He meets with the figurehead royalty there, Prince William, and his wife Wilhelmina, and he is able to successfully kind of pull himself together and do what a diplomat does. He can be very charming at times, and they're very successful. And while he is in the Netherlands and has had this great success, he receives a letter from John Jay in France, in France, that the English are now ready to settle and end the war. And so he's called back, and he goes back with his children. I want to tell you, though, on the way, while he's in the Netherlands, I mentioned John Quincy, who was enrolled in the University of Leiden at the time and was a wonderful student, very, very exceptionally bright. During that time, John allows him to become the secretary to the American legation to Russia, and he's 14 years old. Now, I have a 14-year-old grandson who I think is very bright and personable, but I find it pretty hard to picture him as accompanying a diplomat, and he serves as the translator, the French translator. Even in Russia, French is the language of diplomacy in Europe and all over the world at that time. So John Quincy, even though John knows there's some danger involved, and when John Quincy returns, I think he's away about 18 months to 2 years, he comes back through a very convoluted journey from Russia through Germany and the Netherlands. So it was not a light undertaking either, but he's very successful. And as I said to you, they groomed him. Not only did they groom him for greatness, he had acquired so much experience in working with foreign countries and diplomats when he was just a young boy. So you can imagine by the time he became president later, as the seventh president, he was well prepared. He was also the Secretary of State under Jefferson later. So John goes kind of reluctantly because he's actually quite happy in the Netherlands, and he's receives a lot of accolades. The Spanish foreign minister, for example, calls him the George Washington of diplomacy in Europe. So John shares that with a friend. He's very, very flattered. And I would say in the negotiations with the English, it is the strength and determination and obstinacy in some parts of John Adams that allows the Americans to be so successful with the Treaty of Paris. They gain really far more than one could expect for England to cede to a fragile upstart country. And they receive a lot of land, fishing rights on the eastern coast, monetary settlement, and Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams are the American negotiators for that treaty, the peace treaty with England. But Benjamin Franklin is sidelined with illness most of that time. He suffered from gout and was in pain a lot of the time. So it was really John Adams and John Jay who did the heavy lifting. And again, you know, as I told you, John has a great sense of humor, and he wrote to Abigail at one point saying, well, I'll never be a wealthy man. I can't leave my kids much, but I'm going to be leaving them a lot of fish. And what he meant was that he had successfully negotiated those fishing rights. So he remains in Europe. He works with Franklin to further negotiations and work. They're hoping to have a treaty as well with France, an economic treaty, and with other European countries. And they're joined by Thomas Jefferson. In the meantime, Abigail has been home with her daughter. And and I forgot to say, Charles, the middle son, stays with a couple of years with John, but he was very homesick and physically sick a lot of the time. So he's sent home with, a guardian back home. So he's back home already too, Charles. And so, and Abigail has already been separated from John while he's in Europe at this point for 4 years. And ultimately, John Adams is going to be spending a decade, 10 years in Europe, away from his home state. So Abigail wanted to go even on the first trip with John, but John persuaded her that it was too dangerous, too expensive, and she stayed home, and she's really been what we kind of call historians a deputy wife. She's taken, a deputy husband. She's taken over all of his responsibilities, as I said, supervising the farm, all their financial dealings, the children. And she really feels enough is enough. It's way too long. She wants to join him, but she's deathly afraid of crossing the ocean. And she also has an elderly father that she helps to take care of, and she has her 2 younger sons. But now at this point, John is also saying it's enough. If we're going to stay here in Europe, and it sounds like John is going to become the ambassador to England, he wants Abigail beside him. So she finally gathers her courage. Her father passes away during that period, so she no longer has that obligation. And she also is able to, I don't want to say foster, but have her 2 younger boys board with her sister and brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law is a minister He's very erudite, and they run a little school, and they're going to help train those two boys to go on to Harvard eventually. So she gathers her courage, she goes, she voyages with their daughter, Nabby, Abigail Jr., her name is Abigail also, but they call her Nabby, to Europe. Also has kind of a harrowing journey. The war is over, so she's not worried about hostile British troops, but also have a very stormy voyage. She and the others in her party, she brings a servant girl, become deathly ill with seasickness. There's a point where she's so weak that she has to have somebody put on her shoes for her. She doesn't have the strength to do that. And Abigail's a very proper New England woman, and the idea of being in these close quarters with all these sailors and the smell from the potash and the oil from the ship, it's quite a harrowing journey. But once she feels better, she actually goes out on deck often at night, and she's just marvels. She writes about how the sea with the stars sparkling on it is like seeing diamonds that have been just spread across the ocean. And they finally get to the coast of England. They're put on a little tiny boat to get them off the ship onto land. The waves are so strong that she and her daughter and many in the party are physically like thrown on to the sand with the waves. So, you can imagine landing there. And then they have to take a coach. They stay at an inn along the way, and they are to meet John in London. But John's tied up with business in the Netherlands. And so John Quincy, their son, eventually comes to meet them. And they spend a couple of weeks in London, and Abigail is quite impressed. She writes to her sister, I actually like it here better than I had expected, because she's been a fierce nationalist American, and the English are her enemies. And so she did not expect to actually find London as congenial as she wished or thought that she would, but she is also enamored of the culture, the idea of going to plays. She hears a concert of Handel's Messiah. Those are things she could never, that level of culture has not come to the United States yet. And but she also sees something that will trouble her terribly, and that convinces her many times of the superiority of America. She sees such a gulf between the rich and poor in Europe, and she can walk out of her nice hotel and see beggars in the street all the time, something that she doesn't find. Now, she and John both know there are slaves in America in the South, but she's never been there yet. But most Americans at that time were at least subsistence farmers. They made enough to support their families. So certainly there were people who were poor, but generally they were helped by the community. And she's right, there is not that huge gulf between the royalty, the aristocracy, and the common man. There are wealthy people in America, but not this great gulf. So anyway, she's reunited with John. He comes to meet them, and then they speed by carriage across the channel to France. And now she has a bigger cultural shock, because they are renting what was formerly a very beautiful mansion. It's quite run down now, but it's over 40 rooms. And that's quite a difference. She has a nice little house in Quincy in Massachusetts. It's a typical salt box with I think there's a big kitchen, what we would call a living space, in a dining area, and then 4 bedrooms upstairs. Nothing like, and she has a little help in the house, but nothing like this 43 room mansion. And you need at least 8 servants there. And she's also shocked and appalled that in France, servants have very circumscribed duties. So she has to have a hairdresser, because that's de rigueur in France. Women have to have their hair dressed every day. She has someone who's only in charge of making beds. someone who only will wash the floor. And she remarks again to her sister, 8 people here. In America, 1 or 2 servants could have done all the same things. But on the other hand, she overlooks a beautiful garden. She remarks about nightingales singing at night. She can hear them. She and John become very close friends with Thomas Jefferson, who's there at the time, and his daughters are well, at least his oldest daughter is there at the time as well. They dine together. And but she's not impressed with royalty. She says over and over again that they just live dissipated lives, wasted lives. And she meets the king and queen, and she finds them can be charming, but she feels it's ridiculous the all the rituals at court every day. But they're there about 8 months before John, and I see where time is going by, so I'll have to condense this a little more quickly. But after 8 months, they go to England, where John becomes the first American ambassador to England. And it's a challenge because, again, as we are having 2 countries that became enemies during a very long, bloody war. And when John comes to London, Abigail writes her sister and says she reads in the paper, can you, in the newspaper, the largest paper says, Ambassador Adams is there. What a sound, the name of ambassador from our rebellious colonies. So she's treated courteously, but it's a kind of a mixed bag. The one thing I really want to talk about is her first encounter with King George and Queen Charlotte. A few weeks after she arrives, and John leaves most of the everyday things to her. She's the one who finds them a beautiful mansion in Grafsfjordur Park, which is a very beautiful area. She gets it. The rent is affordable for them. It has 3 floors. Again, they need 8 servants. And it's in a beautiful area. But a few weeks after she arrives, she has kind of a command performance with the king and queen. And that command performance is 200 to 300 people in the room. And there's a huge room. And she spends all morning getting ready. Abigail appreciates elegance and refinement, but she doesn't like extravagance. So she has to have a beautiful dress made. She tells the dressmaker to make it as elegant but as simple as possible. From the description, pretty not simple to us, beautiful yards of tulle with layers and flowers, and she's wearing pearls at her neck, and she always has a cap on, so she's got a little headgear with pearls coming out and feathers. But that's simple for the time. And they arrive. I think they have to stand, the 300 people are around the periphery. They stand for about 2 hours till the king gets to her and he greets her. And he says something like, pray, Mrs. Adams, tell me how you spent your day today, just to make conversation, because as she said, they have to make small talk with 300 people around the circle. And she writes to her sister afterwards, and she said, well, I could have said, if I was honest, I spent the whole morning getting ready to meet with you, getting my hair done, getting dressed, getting over here. She can't say that. So she says, oh, something like, I appreciate looking in the neighborhood. It's so beautiful, etc. And he basically asks her every time they meet, he asks her the same question each time, the same question over and over again. She's very unimpressed with King George and Queen Charlotte. She thinks they are actually simple compared to that court. The British court is simple compared to the Parisian court, to the French court. She just thinks they spend their days in frivolous, pursuits. And she's very critical. And again, the Adamses spend a number of years in London, another 4 years or so. And just to sum up quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions, John and Abigail and Thomas Jefferson, when he comes to join them, are so frustrated. They can't move any treaties forward with England, not really with France. None of them can understand why the European nations don't understand how important the American contribution could be. They have wonderful resources. But the British and the French are more interested in trying to figure out the balance of power in Europe, and both of them are trying to be the leading country in Europe. America, they consider an experiment that's going to fail, so they're not as interested. But Thomas Jefferson does visit for about, I think he was supposed to come for 3 weeks, then he ends up staying a couple of months in England. And while they're not successful in their diplomacy, he and John take a wonderful 10-day to 2-week trip to see the English countryside and the stately homes. They're both very interested in farming. John loves, he visits one mansion with a hothouse where they're growing out of season strawberries and plums and beautiful flowers, and he's very entranced. And they go together, they visit Shakespeare's home. And this is kind of mind-boggling to us. They take one of them takes their penknife and takes a splinter of wood from Shakespeare's chair as a souvenir. Can you imagine going into a historic home at this time and doing something like that? They didn't think anything of it, and nobody said anything to them. And they were pleased to that. And during that time too in England, Abigail did really again take advantage. She went to see plays with Shakespearean plays with the leading British actress at the time. She went to museums. Oh, she took a series of scientific lectures, talks about electricity. And she does write to, one thing she does like in Europe is that she finds women have more educational opportunities than they do in America at that time. And she writes kind of wistfully to one niece, it was like going to a fairyland or a foreign country that American women aren't allowed to visit. So even though she complained about almost everything else in Europe and constantly said she couldn't wait, her soul was in America, couldn't wait to return, that's one thing that did please her. And she's a very brilliant, self-educated woman. And really, as I said, I would think John's equal. When she came back to America, when John was president, some political leaders in Massachusetts had written, if John was to die in office, there was nobody they thought who could replace him better than Abigail, better than any man at the time. So she was known, she was very politically astute. And anyway, they finally come home. They're very excited about taking their place in American history. But what Europe does for them is, I would say, strengthen their ideas of what the ideal American should be. And most of it is what they didn't want, what they saw in England as the rule by the aristocracy and oligarchy made up of influential people who either because they were wealthy or especially handsome and beautiful or very charismatic, were really the leaders. And they felt that this could happen in America too, that people had to be vigilant all the time. What they wanted is that there should be people of merit. And also John very much felt that all people, Americans weren't better than Europeans. All people were really subject to the same foibles and temptations. And what would really distinguish America, he hoped the United States, would be that it would be a country ruled by law, rather than individual whims. So they were exposed, they left America as, I would say, very well-read, capable provincials. And they came back as very sophisticated travelers. But the heart of their geography, I guess I would say, their moral geography was always in America. And it only became more strengthened while they were in Europe. So I've gone on, there's so many, and I had all these quotes to read to you that I didn't, but maybe they'll come out in the questions, and we can talk about some of the influences in Europe.
Thank you, Jeannie, so much for taking us on that journey and, reminding us and reminding me just of our roots and, even to have a treaty about fish, that we take so much for granted, that somebody had to forge those treaties for us. And what an extraordinary couple, an extraordinary journey. And at this time, we would love to welcome your questions. You can post them in the chat and I will ask them out loud for everybody. And while you're doing that, and thinking about questions, I have a question for you, Jeannie.
Yeah.
How do you even go about doing research like this? Where do you start?
Okay, well, let me tell you, I have been out of college for 50 years, but let me tell you how I got into this. And when I was a freshman in college, I had taken advanced placement history. So I was able to go to an advanced history course, and my first was in early American history. And one of my first assignments, and I'm from a small town in upstate New York, so being in New York altogether was like a terrific experience. I was sent to the New York Historical Society, and I had to do a paper on loyalists in the American Revolution. So I was, I finished school a bit early, so I was like 17, I guess I would say. And I told the librarian there what I was trying to do, and she came out with a box of letters from loyalists in the 1770s. And I was a teenager, I was blown away. And that started a lifelong love affair with primary sources. To have those in my hands, which I don't think anybody would let you do now, but they did that. I don't remember having to put on gloves or anything. So history was always my main interest, and particularly colonial history. So anyway, I have a PhD in American history, but my job here really had to do with Jewish history. And so I spent a lot of time, and I still do, on American Jewish history, Jews in the West, in particular in Colorado. But I always had that major focus on early American history, which brought me to my first book. And then the second, it's not my first book, but the first book of Beck that had to do with American history. And it's the letters that have always attracted me. So how do I do the research? Well, we're fortunate now. Almost all the founders' letters are online, but they weren't always. But there are volumes and volumes. Thomas Jefferson alone wrote over 18,000 letters during his lifetime. So for this particular book, I examined thousands of letters and diaries. We're very fortunate. John and Abigail both kept diaries. Hers was rather short, but his was multi volumes. And in those letters and diaries, you get to see a little different picture, kind of an intimate portrait that helps you kind of construct that. So I had to read a lot of secondary sources too, to, see what was going on in alternative opinions. While they were revolutionary comrades, Franklin and Adams got along quite well. But John increasingly, as I said, became more and more suspicious of Franklin. And Franklin was angry with John because he felt John was too volatile to be a diplomat, and that he was angering the French, and that he was going to ultimately sabotage the alliances he had gained. So he wrote to Congress, and I love this letter, but he wrote to one of his colleagues and said, Adams is always honest, brilliant, but sometimes out of his head in some ways. And what he meant was he could say things that Franklin was appalled at. Franklin was what I call kind of a chameleon personality. He could kind of reinvent himself to suit his audience, and John could never do that. He was a man of great integrity. Okay, I didn't read it, but I saw there was a question in the chat.
Yes. How was Abigail self-educated? Did she have access to more than her family library? How much did she correspond with other historical figures? The presentation was wonderful. Please come back and tell us more.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, first of all, Abigail was kind of sickly as a child. And remember, I told you that we think, we're right. I mean, COVID is a tremendous challenge and it's taken so many lives. But in Abigail's time, there was illness circulating all the time. And her parents would not let her go to school because she was considered sickly. And when she was like 6 or 7, there was a diphtheria outbreak among children, for example, in her time. And something like 15% of the children in Quincy died from that diphtheria outbreak. So they were probably overprotective of her. But her father was a minister. Her mother was from a very prominent political family. She and her sisters were educated in the house, had great access to the library. And again, remember I told you John Quincy was only 14 when he went to Russia. I think 14 was a lot older then than it is now. And so she was already reading as a teenager political tracts, religious tracts, novels, plays, philosophy. And her next mentor, well, 2 mentors, her brother-in-law, one of her older sisters, had a husband who was also highly educated. He shared his materials with her and they had great discussions. And John Adams had one of the largest libraries in the area. And so she learned so much. And yes, she corresponded. We have wonderful letters with Jefferson, with her sisters especially. I mean, she's so descriptive. I mean, I didn't tell you a fraction. I mean, her descriptions of life in France and England are so insightful, and she's so sharp, and she understands people and politics so well, and she's so descriptive. One of her favorite places in England was a grotto. I forgot the name of the author, Pope, I think, that built. He built. It was kind of a cave, and he decorated it with stalagmites and jewels, and she writes about all of those things. And she's constantly has references from the library, from literature, from philosophy, from history. So she really was a brilliant woman and self-educated in the sense, I mean, not self, she had a lot of guidance along the way, but probably superior to any higher education that we have today. And Europe was an education.
So it sounds like, she was driven and far more ahead of her time, given that most women were suppressed in their education, and she was encouraged, or she had a fortitude and a drive of her own that people respected. And
right. I think in many ways she was a woman ahead of her times, but I want to be cautious. There's one historian that I disagree with that considers her a proto-feminist. I think she was not at all. She very much believed in separate roles for men and women and separate spheres, but she was extremely bright in certain ways. I mean, everybody always quotes that letter to her husband when he was in the Continental Congress about remember the ladies. But she wasn't talking about full rights. She was really talking about revoking the laws of coverture. Coverture in the United States was that women were under the cover of their husbands and that they couldn't own land or sign any contracts or anything on their own. So she was talking about something very specific. But she did say at times that if she had the right to vote, and one of the counties, I can't remember if it was New Jersey, for a short time, women were allowed to vote there if they had 50 pounds worth of property. I don't mean pounds, but it would be dollars. I don't mean pounds in weight. And that didn't last very long. But she felt that women certainly were affected by politics, so they should have some voice. But she was content to have her husband be the voice. But he very much respected her opinion, listened to her. She was his confidant and advisor, sometimes negatively. She supported the Alien and Sedition Acts, and she pushed him on that. And that was one of the reasons he was defeated for president. And that those acts were really very stringent on immigrants. She felt that there was a revolution brewing from people across the sea. So, she certainly made some mistakes, but she was an uncommon woman for her time, our time. I think she would stand up just as well today.